Hello, and welcome to our final session today. It's sure to be a very interesting one around the impact of cookie and privacy changes on identity services. We've got a couple of things just to mention before we start. If you have any questions, any issues, or you just want to chat to other participants, feel free to drop those into the chat. And as always, if you have any questions, we've got Q&A at the end. So if you want to put questions in as we go, you're more than welcome to pop those into the Q&A panel. And here with us this afternoon, we have Heather Flanagan, who's Technical Liaison for SeamlessAccess and Principal at Spherical Consulting, and also Adam Snook, who's Technical Consultant here at OpenAthens. They've both got a wealth of experience in the identity and access space, and I'm sure they'll tell you more about what they do as we go along. And I think, Heather, you're going to speak first.
All righty then. Make sure I've got everything unmuted correctly. All right, so what we're covering today, I'm sure many of you have noticed on the news, in social media, in your government's legislation, that there's a lot of changes happening in the privacy landscape online. And these changes have definitely reached down into the depths where the standards development happens, where the large companies that work on web browsers make changes, all these things. So today we're going to talk a little bit about all of that, what's happening, and what the implications are for federated identity, which is one of the mechanisms to remotely access content. So it's kind of funny to talk about this now, because if you look at, all right, what mechanisms are popular when it comes to accessing content remotely? Well, right now, IP address authorization absolutely dominates. It is, in some senses, the easiest for the end user, because as long as they're at a site and that site's IP addresses have been registered with the appropriate publisher or service provider, then it all just magically works. The other most common mechanisms out there include SAML and username and password, and then there's a couple of other small things. So, okay, if you now look at the academic and STM space, then it's a little bit more heavily SAML based, and there are more individuals that are engaged in the effort of trying to get to their content online. But when you look at the general or the humanities and social sciences, then you're looking at something that's a bit heavier on the legacy mechanisms of IP addresses and library cards and things like that. And there's fewer individual people trying to actually access the content that are recognized as individuals. Each mechanism, each of the main mechanisms we talk about, they've actually got good and bad points to it. So IP address authorization, it's kind of easy to implement. Maintaining it, however, can be challenging, especially these days, as IP addresses are much more likely to change. I was talking to someone who worked at MIT libraries, and why would the IT department tell the library that, oh, by the way, we're selling off half of our IP addresses, which caused them quite the scramble as they tried to, what do we do? We've got to contact all our publishers, everything we subscribe with, all of that has to change. If you're outside of academia and say working in the pharmaceutical industry, where mergers happen all the time, and that means the IP address ranges change, it isn't as stable a thing as you might think. One could argue that it's more private, but that's only if you're coming from an academic, consolidated use case. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. The security of that definitely varies. Using IP addresses, that's never what it was intended for. So the security mechanisms, whether they're good or bad, there are people who have opinions about that. And there's no good way to personalize the experience, which is becoming more important to users. There's federated authentication, hard to implement, easy to maintain once you've done. It can be better with privacy, again, depending on how it's done. From here, I mean, you can read the slide and you can see how things do vary a bit. Now, this is all, This is not a standard slide in terms of, you might find people that would argue one way or the other against some of the specifics, but in general, I think it's pretty correct. So let's now start looking at it a little bit more from a standards perspective and the perspective of what it looks like from a web browser's space. What do the Googles, the Firefoxes, the Microsoft Edges, the Apple Safaris of the world, what does all of that look like? Well, they have a specific set of problems that they're trying to solve when it comes to the privacy landscape. So we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about in how they solve that problem, which is tracking. What are they trying to do? And we'll get into a bit more detail on the timing of that and some of the next steps. Then I'm going to hand it over to Adam to talk a bit about the OpenAthens implications for some of this. So before I dive into detail, something to make sure you're aware of, and this is important if you support end users. There's a difference between a web browser and the web browser engine. Web browsers, you know, when we talk about Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Edge, Brave, if you're into one that's particularly privacy preserving, those are the browsers, that's what the user sees. But underlying those are different engines that actually hold the capabilities of what they can, what those browsers can actually do. And there you have Blink, which is also known as Chromium, Gecko, which underlies Firefox, and WebKit. Why is that important? That's important because since the functionality is based on what the browser engine can do, all browsers that run on Apple devices, iOS or iPadOS, are actually built on WebKit. They're built on the same thing that Safari is built on. So WebKit, for example, does not support third-party cookies. It just doesn't. And so someone may be running Chrome on their iOS device, but it's not going to behave like Chrome on a desktop. It's going to behave differently because the browser engine is different. Similarly, when you're now looking at the what's happening on a desktop, Edge and Chrome are all built on Blink. So underneath them, they're coming with much the same features. The developers may have chosen to turn some on and off, but the functionality is largely the same. Okay, now that you got that, and you know that when someone comes to you and says, this isn't working, and I'm running Chrome, ask what platform they're running it on, because it matters. All right, so what's the general problem statement that the browser people are concerned about? We came to consensus on this. I ran a workshop that included Google and Apple and Microsoft and Firefox and Facebook and a few others last year. And it was the motherhood and apple pie of problem statements that non-transparent, uncontrollable tracking of users across the web needs to be addressed and prevented. Yes, we all could agree to that, which is great. The problem is when you come to federated identity, many of the applications and services that we work through the browser to support federated authentication, they use the same features that tracking does. And so from the browser's perspective, they're completely indistinguishable. Can't tell the difference between, you know, someone that's actually tracking a person on the web without that person's knowledge versus, no, it's actually a legitimate authentication event. It looks the same as far as the browser is concerned. So what do they do? Well, right now they're really considering, you know, okay, well, we'll put federated authentication aside for the moment. What do we want to deal with? The browser vendors know of very specific features that can be used for tracking, and that's what's under consideration for complete redesign. Third-party cookies. And I'll define what each of these are in just a moment, but those are high on the list of features that need to be just removed, done away with, used no more in order to create a more privacy preserving experience. And browser vendors, you know, it's not like the browser vendors are doing this with one voice, with one model. While they agree on the problem, the solutions are definitely diverging such that some of you are probably old enough to remember the phrase, it only runs on IE, only runs on Internet Explorer. You have to use this browser to access this thing. We're absolutely heading back into that landscape where what what sites you get to, it'll depend on what browser you want to use. Okay. Here's the next thing to remember as we're talking through all of this, and that is, I mean, I know a lot of you are coming from the landscape of education, possibly from healthcare. That's not what the browser vendors are looking at. They're coming, their leading driver of for the browser vendors is the consumer web. What's happening in the consumer space where individuals are largely individuals. I mean, the implications here means that the browser developers don't really understand the government use case or the academic use case or fintech for that matter, financial systems, healthcare. They know all of those are a thing, but they don't add up to the sheer weight of numbers, the sheer weight of money that the consumer web does. So they try and take that into account, but the main driver is going to be the consumer web. Okay, how does tracking even happen? Well, there's these things called third-party cookies. IP addresses are actually considered in the consumer web space a really easy way to track somebody. Browser fingerprinting, link decoration, bounce tracking, all of these terms. What do these mean? Let's talk about that for a minute. Okay, cookies. Nom nom. Cookies are small blocks of data that are created while a user is browsing the web, and it's put in their browsers, basically in their browser's memory. And a first-party cookie means that the website that caused that piece of data to be written is the only site that can read that data. It's accessible only to the domain that created it. Third-party cookies are accessible to any domain at all. Sometimes this is a really useful feature if you're dealing with an organization that, say, has more than one domain name. If you want to go to the extremes, you know, if you look at a company that does software as a service, we'll say Salesforce, for example. Salesforce actually has over 400, close to 500 different domains. So they are heavily reliant in some ways on third-party cookies for some of their behaviors. But trackers also love to set these because then they can just check in all the time to say, where did this user go? Where did this user go? Where did this user go? And they can tell because of what's in the cookie and how it was set. Okay, IP addresses. Well, IP addresses were used to define machines and services. And to this day, they're still often used for making authorizations decisions. Libraries use them. ERP systems use them as well. That's never what they were exactly designed for. Identification, yes, but authorization, no. That was not the intent. And there's a lot more technology underneath all of that, where the most common IP address spaces that we're used to, called IPv4, which is like the 152.1.1.12. Okay, that's an IPv4 address. Well, there's a limited number of those, and they're running out. You can't just create new IPv4 addresses. There are only so many. Just math deals with that, and so they become a commodity. They're being sold, bought and sold regularly. I actually have friends who work in that industry where they buy and sell IP addresses. But that's really hard for when you're depending on those for authorization decisions. So they're identified as a thing that can be used in many cases to actually track a person, track their machine, track their phone, track something about them online. Even though it's becoming less of a stable mechanism, it is still a part of it. Okay. Now we're going on to the next thing. So much to try and remember with all of this. Another form of tracking is through link decoration, and that's when additional information is added to the URL. And it's used for very good things. It's used for when you're typing in a query, you're trying to do a search, you may notice that the URL in your browser suddenly gets a whole lot longer. There's usually like a question mark and then stuff. Perfectly legitimate use case. In some authentication scenarios, the front channel, where it's all in front of the user in the browser, where everything can see it, that uses link decoration, but it's also a great way to track things. You might be used to seeing, if you click on a link in your email, the URL will come up with a question mark. UTM equals, it's like the method to get here was this. You came in because this was on a mailing list and you were a subscriber and this was the scenario. All of that can be added into the links themselves. And then there's browser fingerprinting. This one is a lot of fun, and there are ways you can actually go to a website that the Electronic Freedom Foundation has, and you can say, how unique is my web browser anyway? I mean, really, could someone actually identify my browser out of all the other millions and millions of browser experiences going online at any given moment? And the answer is usually yes. And in fact, the more you do to protect yourself by putting in add-ons and plugins and things like that, the more you make your browser very, very unique to you. So it's a great way to track a user across the web, because all that information can just be aggregated into a database somewhere on where you don't see it, and they know where you've been. The last one I'll just mention is bounce tracking. This is a way that some sites have used to try and get around that. It has to be a first-party cookie because the one domain sets it, and therefore that domain sees it. Well, if you do this almost invisible, bounce the user over to the tracker's domain and then back to where they're trying to get to, that makes it a first-party moment. You've been to that website, therefore it must be okay for them to set that cookie. That's really poor form and kind of rude, and yet it's also a very legitimate mechanism for certain authentication services. OpenID Connect in particular does that all the time. So if the browsers say, okay, we're going to stop doing that, you're going to break a major component of how authentication works on the web. All right, that was a lot of technical detail dumped really fast, mostly to make sure that you had the terminology of what's going on, and okay, you're addressing tracking, but what does that mean? What is tracking? And tracking are those common mechanisms, and those mechanisms, the link declaration, the third-party cookies, the browser fingerprinting, all of that, those are the mechanisms that you have to think about when you're supporting your users. Because they're all under threat by the browser vendors themselves as they try and solve a bigger problem. And with that, I'm going to switch over to Adam, and he can talk about, well, all of that's well and good, but what's the impact to OpenAthens and your services?
Hello, thank you very much, Heather. Oh, it's the first time I've spoken in this room, a little bit echoey. Yeah, so the long and short of it is, in theory, there's not a huge direct impact with OpenAthens just yet, but we'll go into that in a lot more detail over the next few slides. Slide, please. So the very short version, authentication that uses SAML is, it should all behave in exactly the same way it does currently for at least like 2 to 3 years. And OpenAthens is very much a SAML house. So again, in theory, not directly connected. The only thing, slide, that will definitely be affected is single logout. But again, from an OpenAthens perspective, we explicitly do not support single logout. So you shouldn't be affected by that, which is good. Next. WAIF services. So where are you from? That's the organization discovery piece when you're on a vendor website and you're trying to log in. They sometimes ask what federation you're from, what organization you're from. There are all kinds of different WAIF services. SeamlessAccess, Wayfinder are kind of centrally managed versions. Different publishers or vendors will have their own. In theory, again, they should continue to work, with the exception of the remembering your previous organization. So you've been to one vendor, you've said you're from Anglia Ruskin University. Hi, Alex. Then you go to another vendor, and currently you're then remembered in if it's something like SeamlessAccess or Wayfinder. That kind of thing Depending on the type of WAF service, so if it's, say, a centrally managed service where you're kind of redirected over to SeamlessAccess or Wayfinder or the UK Fed Central Discovery Service, that should, again, in theory work because it's using first-party cookies. But if people have used the advanced options of SeamlessAccess, Wayfinder, others are available, that where you embed it on your website, say, those currently would be effectively using third-party cookies, so likely to break in the future. Next. Services that share information, like, so say you go to your ILS or LMS, depending where you are in the world, and you've got loads of widgets on your web page from various other vendors. Those, again, possibly going to break, but mixed results. This is all quite a moving target. It's very early days, but yeah, that will definitely probably be affected. Again, from an OpenAthens perspective, we don't permit the embedding of our services in terms of the authentication points, the login point, and that was a decision we made a few years ago just because of security. So again, you won't be affected by this because you were affected by it a few years ago when we disabled it. Next. Yeah, the interesting one is IP things. So sometimes referred to as IP authentication, I say incorrectly, is kind of, as Heather said in previous slide, it's more about the authorization or recognition. So straightforward, what would you call it? Say on campus, on site IP recognition or authorization, that will likely be affected. Again, at the moment, as Heather was mentioning, Safari, if you've got, I forget what it's called, I plus subscription.
Plus subscribers.
Thank you very much. So they currently effectively mask the public IP. So if you were on network and you had a student that come in, like bring your own device, and they were a subscriber of that service, they'd likely be unable to access subscribed content currently because that's already blocked. In theory, more browsers could do this because it's everything that is remotely linked to tracking is in scope, as Heather said in a previous thing. So there are ways to potentially mitigate that. So as it stands at the moment, if you're using, say, a VPN or a proxy service kind of thing, then unlikely to be affected as we understand it at the moment. Next. This is the biggie. So yeah, wafeless linking. So we mentioned about WAF services where you go to a publisher, vendor, and you search, where are you from? Lots of people that use link resolvers, discovery services, cataloging systems, well, they want to take their users direct to that place in as seamless a manner as possible. So they use things called wafeless linking, which is where it basically provides, I'm from this organization already, don't ask my users where they're from. Because most vendors, not all, but most vendors, it's all done through link decoration, where it would say like question mark, entity ID equals, and then target equals. So what organization you're from and where you're trying to go. That's all link decoration. So as it stands at the moment, that's definitely in scope, which could be problematic. A lot of development. So whilst it won't directly affect OpenAthens, it will, of course, affect OpenAthens because whilst a lot of it might be out of our control, vendors, publishers, platform providers, potentially a lot of development work on how to seamlessly link to your products. Next. I'm all right for time. So going on a diet. Damn it, we like cookies. So as Heather was saying, Safari right now already blocks third-party cookies. So anything that would be affected by third-party cookies, anyone using Safari will currently be seeing those issues. Firefox have like a blacklist. So they've got thousands of domains in their effectively centrally managed blacklist of, let's call them nefarious domains that do tracking. Chrome, as it stands at the moment, haven't done anything in blocking. They did, but they rolled it back. But next year, is it next year? Yes, next year, they should be rolling out so that it will be blocking third-party cookies by default. As it stands at the moment, it is a feature flag. You can go into your settings and turn it off. So slide. Oh, no, I jumped ahead. Yeah, cool, thanks. So yeah, we mentioned what does break when third-party cookies are gone. So you can certainly see this in Safari now. Single logout. So if you are using OpenAthens, we don't support single logout because, from my perspective, it's just terrible user experience. But if you are using enterprise single sign-on systems or SIAM, which is I forget what the C stands for, but like enterprise single sign-on services, they might support it. So you can go log out of your, I know, Azure, let's say, and then that will send requests to log you out of anything you've logged into via that enterprise single sign-on system. That will break with third-party cookies because that's how that is tracked. Certain things, as Heather was saying, with OIDC will break, so things along the front channel and things like that. So this is more directed at our Keystone customers, because people will know that uses OIDC to effectively bridge a connection into OpenAthens, where we then provide the outsourced SAML SB. To me, it's looking like that won't be overly affected due to the way it's built, especially with the session management largely being done through SAML. But again, watch this space. But IDP persistence certainly will be affected with the removal of third-party cookies, because a lot of vendors, a lot of publishers do like to embed those discovery services on their platforms, because then you're on their site, branding is a better user experience. And the remembering of your previous organization across multiple vendors, or indeed on the same vendor, won't be possible. So even though the WAIF or discovery service will still function, it just won't remember the previously logged in organization. Got 2 minutes, next. So yeah, this was the slide I thought I was on earlier. If you want to test it with the third-party cookies being disabled, yeah, try and use Safari. One thing to try and use is Microsoft Teams in a browser in Safari. That just pretty much just fundamentally won't work. In Chrome, as I mentioned, it's something you can just turn on in the Chrome settings. So if you go next, because I think I put a screenshot, because this is from me, this is my browser settings. I've had third-party cookies disabled for a number of years because I just don't like cookies, I don't like tracking, and it makes my life much easier. So that is something that's readily available now within Chrome, and largely not been too disruptive for me, but there are a few little quality of life things that obviously might be easier if they were still logged on. Next. IP addresses. This is what we were talking about before. So if you're using that iCloud subscription, they effectively mask your public IP. So if you were using straightforward on-campus IP recognition or authorization, that in theory shouldn't work because you effectively get a masked IP, not your campus IP. So things where that becomes less of an issue is if you're using a VPN or a managed proxy service, which, as probably a lot of you on the call know, we have one of those. And again, it looks like that will effectively bypass this and still present that proxy IP. So that should be okay. Next. Timelines. So Apple and Mozilla don't publish a public timeline of when they're likely to be rolling things out. Google do have a roadmap or a timeline. It's relatively high level, so it won't necessarily say exactly when something's going to go into the public domain, where all Chrome instances will have this particular thing turned on or indeed turned off. But it is useful just to give an indication on what they're working on, what areas they're investigating, and they do publish when they're effectively going to be available for alpha/beta testing as well. Next, I'm conscious of time. A takeaway for you: SeamlessAccess, our friends at SeamlessAccess, have produced an FAQ, which is incredibly useful. Because I'm sure there will be a lot of questions on the webinar, but there is already an FAQ that goes into what all of this stuff really means in practical terms for librarians, for IT people, for end users or patrons. So do share it with people. I think the key thing is information dissemination. The worst thing that can happen is in X number of years, all of a sudden, massive amount of change, and you're all sidelined, massive surprises. So do try and stay apprised as much as you can with what's going on. We'll try and help. SeamlessAccess will clearly try and help. W3C and all the various members of the community group will keep you apprised. I'm now 2 minutes over, which for me is not actually that bad. Slide, please. In effect, we are now into the Q&A, unless Heather has anything else to last minute things to add.
The main points I wanted to highlight are, so all of the things we talked about are under consideration for how can they be dealt with such that they can no longer be used for tracking. Third-party cookies, that's one of the most easy for developers to wrap their arms and brains around, which is why that's happening first. The one that's got everybody really anxious is link decoration. And that's one where the developers know they want to do something. Do something. Do what? We don't know, but it's on the list. And they're literally actively talking about it right now. The two groups that are within the W3C that are most actively having these conversations are the privacy community group and the federated identity community group. A quick note about W3C community groups. Anybody can join. It doesn't cost any money. You basically have to register to join and accept the IP considerations, because since there are a lot of commercial entities joining as well, we don't want to end up with any IPR wars or anything like that. So it's pretty straightforward. And we can make sure that the links are available to that, however we make those available. Should we dive into, I see a handful of questions in the Q&A. Should we dive into those?
Yeah, sure. So the first question we have is, who cares the most about this issue? So what sort of kind of sectors or roles might be caring about this rather than, you know, individuals themselves?
Well, that's it's a fascinating question. So for the group that's looking at it from the federated identity perspective itself, probably the biggest driver is Google, because Google is, shall we say, the most conflicted about handling, you know, they know they need to do something, and yet they're also an advertising generator. And so they're trying to, how do we prevent ad networks from tracking you except ours? Because they're also a major, identity provider for so many when you're doing social logins. So they have a lot vested in this. In terms of other participation, it varies a lot. We have people from higher education. We have people from software as a service vendors. Salesforce is there, Microsoft is there, Okta is there, quite a few others.
Excellent, thanks, Heather. Next question we have is, some employers use single sign-on for internal tools. Will these be impacted?
So one of the possible mitigations to all of this in a workforce scenario is if the employer actually manages all the systems, manages all the desktops, and therefore manages all the configurations, that they can override what the browser has itself. So ish. More and more employers are letting people bring their own systems, or don't necessarily manage the systems that the users have because employee privacy and all of that. So it's a very, very mixed bag when it comes to the employer systems. If they don't manage the systems, if they don't manage the browser configurations, and they are dependent on web browser interfaces to access even internal services, then yes, they would still be impacted by the issues we're talking about.
Adam, did you have any follow-up on that one?
No, it was yeah, I was just going to say the same, basically, that if it uses a browser, they'll likely be affected, depending on what it is exactly they're doing. If it, as Heather said, if they actually develop the products and services that they're accessing internally, then put it all on the same domain.
If you can, that's not always practical.
Indeed. Yeah.
Excellent, thanks, Adam. The next question we have is, do we have any information on what Microsoft has planned for their browsers?
So I have the dubious fortune of being able to sit with every single week conversations between Google and Microsoft about what is Microsoft going to do. And it's an open question. Underneath the Edge browser is Blink. It's the same thing that Chrome has. So a lot of the features that get shipped to the Edge developers are by default what Chrome has, what the Chrome people have designed. That said, it's not a one-to-one alignment. Microsoft is also very interested in some of the other proposals out there for how to handle some of these tracking related technologies. There's one called the shared storage, so the storage access API. Storage access API, don't even worry about the technical details for the sake of this conversation. What's important to know is Apple and Firefox think that storage access API is a great idea, and Google thinks it's a terrible idea. So there may be a slight forking in the road between Microsoft trying to pile that on to the browser where Chrome won't, but they haven't really decided yet. It's all still kind of up in the air, as everything that we're looking at in terms of what the browsers will do are in the proposal stage. They're in the project stage. They're not standardized yet. It's part of why we're seeing such a divergence of what are the different browser vendors going to do.
Always once. Thanks, Heather. And the next question we have, speaking of Google, how does CASA and its use of IPs play into this at all?
That is a fascinating question that I don't really know the answer to, because I don't quite understand how CASA works.
Yeah, so it does and it doesn't use IP. In the sense that you need to go on site, so you're recognized as your on-campus IP. So yeah, if in the future other browsers do go down the whole route of blocking all IPs, then that becomes a problem. But once you're on site and you go to the CASA thing to try and say, yep, register at whatever institution, it effectively drops a cookie. So again, potentially in scope, because it's going to be classed as a third-party cookie on any vendor website. You'd assume, but again, watch this space which I think will be the answer to a lot of these questions.
One of the tricky things when it comes to, anytime you start talking about Google, Google, like any other extremely large organization, is entirely a schizophrenic beast that doesn't necessarily know what the different parts are doing. And so the Chrome team is, actively working on changes that will deal with tracking. Does the CASA group know anything about that? Have they been consulted? Have they talked about the implications? Probably not. Probably not. I'm not sure that either side knows the other side exists.
Interesting problem.
Yeah.
Now we have a really big question, probably for both of you. Will federated authentication still exist in 10 years?
Oh, I have opinions on this one. I've got a soapbox. It's right here. I could stand on it for a while. Maybe Adam, you should go first.
Well, I was going to answer it in a bit more of a pragmatic way, I guess. So the answer is yes. Because when you boil down, what does federation or federated access mean? And effectively, it's getting one user from one enterprise or security domain to another. So on the web, that's from my college, let's say, to a publication. So the act of federation, getting someone from your security domain or enterprise to another, that problem is, or requirement, will never go away. If the question is more geared around, will SAML federations, as in like national federations, the OpenAthens Federation, will they still be around? Again, yeah, for sure, definitely in 10 years, because this industry is quite slow moving in terms of big changes like that. But yeah, maybe you'll see other technologies in play, but the concept of federated access is, unless we truly go, like John's earlier really interesting conversation about lifelong learning and having a single ID, and if it really goes a bit more down the consumer market, where I have an account, I'm Adam Snook on the internet, and then I'm affiliated with an organization, yeah, maybe it'll be different.
So similar to Adam's take, will federated authentication exist in 10 years? Yes, in the sense that the site providing the services will be relying on something else to do the authentication, to determine, is this the same Jane Smith that was here last time, right? That's the authentication component. Authorization, that's always been a slightly more complicated thing. Sometimes that is done at the service provider level. Sometimes it's done at the IDP provider level. Now, the mechanism for how that will happen, that I think we're going to see changes. So this is where I think, if I was queen of the universe and I was able to just look out and be omniscient, I've been keeping a close eye on what's happening over in Europe, over on your side of the water, with regards to digital wallets and the EU legislation that is driving countries to develop their wallets, and how those will be used in the education and research setting, such that students will control their token, right? It will be decorated as appropriate from the institution, but they own it, they control it, they determine who gets to see it, and that has really interesting implications for the federation model, the OpenAthens model, the in common model, where you have what federations do more than anything else is they're the hub for sharing metadata. They're the hub such that IDPs and service providers know how to even talk to each other, because rather than setting those agreements up one at a time in what are called bilateral arrangements, they're set up in scenarios such that you do it once and you get the whole world of metadata of all the things that you should be able to connect to. What's my question is, in 10 years, is there a role for federations? Federated authentication? Absolutely. It will continue to be a thing. Will there be a role for federations? That, I think, is a much more fundamental question that is not as, yes, of course there will be. I don't know that there will be at all. I'm curious to see myself.
On that note, I think we should probably call this session to a close. Thanks so much, Heather and Adam, for joining us and for your really interesting insight. If we didn't get to your questions in this session, we'll follow up with you afterwards. And I believe I'm handing over to John to wrap up the day.
Yes, so everybody, thank you so much. My head was still spinning from the final questions in that session. Looking forward to the future of federated authentication and federations. There's a big white paper I was reading probably before Christmas about the financial institutions, global financial institutions, looking to create their own federation and really leverage the information and data that they hold on individual users. So who knows, I might have, yeah, really looking forward to finding out what happens within the next 10 years or so. So I will be quick, I will be brief. I was just reflecting on how valuable it is to share knowledge with people who work in the knowledge sharing sector. This community is global. This community, I think, is forward-looking, and it is incredibly collaborative. So this is a massive thanks to everybody who's taken the time to curate and present their thinking and share it with others. I think it's a universal truth. We can't stand still, and we certainly won't stand still. I mean, one of the things that I'm particularly pride's a dangerous word. I shouldn't probably use that word. One of the things that I find inspiring about working with the OpenAthens teams is how that they constantly look to improve what we do. And I think that means that as the future comes towards us, we will be ready for it. So if I go into the next slide. Thank you for joining Access Lab 2022. Looking forward already to Access Lab 2023. If you could go on to the next slide. Yes, huge thank you to our speakers and our session chairs. I also want to say thank you to some of the team. Can you see that? I don't know if they're going to wave. Yeah, look, some of the team are all sitting over there. There's been a huge amount of work in the background to bring this, the agenda together, to make sure everybody's here on time and to make sure everything ran smoothly. And it did run smoothly. Big thanks to Rob Scasebrook for making sure that even when there was a blip, we just kept moving straight on. I want to say thank you to Cynthia and Michelle and Lauren and Jane and Laura and Phil on bass. That's not true. Phil wasn't on the bass guitar, but Phil has been doing a great work on our social media platforms as well. So if you're interested in speaking in 2023, if you want to, what's the word? If you want to enter our UX Awards in 2023, please get in touch with us at events@openathens.net. Next slide, please, Laura. Thank you to our media sponsor, Research Information. Yeah, that is a website that's packed full of interesting information. And finally, we value your feedback. Somebody, as I speak, or if they're not doing it now, they will already have done so, will be putting in the URL. We can go in and give us some feedback about the day. And is that the final slide? Thank you. No, it's thank you again. So it's thank you for everybody contributing. Thank you for everybody for listening. And maybe, who knows, maybe in 2023 we can get together and do this in person. So thank you very, very much, everybody. Have the most charming evening.